hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We got a special episode today. We're here with Dr. Danielle Allen. She is a professor at Harvard at the Harvard Center for Ethics. She's a political theorist. She's published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. And originally I asked Danielle to be on the show because I was lucky enough to be in the audience at the Library of Congress when she presented her new book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. It was super interesting, and I love talking about the Declaration of Independence, but everything changed and the coronavirus hit America, and Danielle has also been very active, along with her colleagues, in writing out a series of white papers on how we should think about and how we should deal with the coronavirus. Danielle, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Congressman. I'm very happy to be here. Glad to talk with you.
I was doing my reading, kind of felt like I was back at HKS at the Kennedy School.
Yes.
Just trying to prepare, make sure I don't look dumb for the next day. But I am in a better situation because I get to ask the questions.
Yes.
Yeah, you can't
exactly.
you can't threaten
You're in
me
charge.
with. Yeah, you can't threaten me with random questions in class anymore. So the main thrust of, well, we're going to focus on one white paper in particular. There was a series of them, and you wrote it in the Washington Post, a summary about one of them, which basically offers America three different routes. This sort of freeze-in-place idea, this mobilize and transition strategy, and then a surrender strategy. So before we even get to the details of what each of those things mean, they are pretty self-explanatory, but we do need to dive into them. Mm-hmm. I think it seems like the premise for writing about this in the first place is this kind of false choice between having to focus on just saving lives or just focusing on the economy. And do you think we're too binary in that choice?
Exactly. We are absolutely too binary in that choice. And so that was the goal of the white paper series, was to adjust people's attention. The goal was to articulate the view that the pandemic is serious enough to count as essentially an existential threat to the country. The magnitude of impact was such that it could overwhelm the health system. And with that, you would have then other sort of downstream problems of legitimacy for public institutions, and it would be very destabilizing. So the view was one needed to think about this as on an analogy to putting oneself on a war footing, that we needed to mobilize our resources to address this existential threat. And when you do that, there are really already existing good ethical frameworks for thinking about questions of protecting lives, defending lives, mobilizing the economy to do that. So mobilizing the economy is fully aligned with a project of saving lives and defending the stability and health of a society.
Yeah, and you're at the Institute of Ethics, and so explain how ethics is intertwined into this, and are we thinking about it the right way? Go ahead.
So sure. No, I mean, at our center, we work broadly in the space of applied ethics, and sometimes it's called professional ethics, but ethics in public affairs. So it's the recognition that any time as a society we have to pick a strategic direction, the first question is really, what are our values? What are our overarching objectives? And at the end of the day, we can't actually really make sound policy choices unless we know what our overarching values and shared commitments are. So we do think ethics and values has an important role to play in policy conversations. In this specific instance of the coronavirus situation, what happened was just that I read an article, sort of relatively early on in the crisis, about an expectation that there would need to be rationing decisions around things like ventilators and hospital care and so forth. And that was the moment when I really realized, I should have realized it sooner probably, but that was the moment when I realized just how fundamental and deep the ethics questions would be. And so I reached out to the author of that and said, okay, hey, we have an ethics center. What we do is always try to connect different kinds of expertise together, economic expertise with philosophical expertise, with public health expertise, with legal expertise, and so forth. We always sort of try to play that kind of coordinating role. So I reached out and said, how can we help? What could we do in this moment? And he said that he thought the hardest question people were having was this issue of how to trade off economic goals and life-saving goals. So we pulled a team together and we got to work and came up with a view that I articulated at the top of this conversation, namely that we shouldn't think of these things as a trade-off. We have to recognize the existential threat, and then the goal is to mobilize the economy to meet that existential threat, just as in a war you mobilize the economy to provide yourself with the resources to address the existential threat. So we should be engaging our economy in fighting this fight, not shutting it down.
Yeah. Oh, and you're seeing this debate play out, and they don't necessarily call it an ethics debate. It's more like a Twitter rage mob debate.
Yes.
But
yeah,
but that's what it is. I mean, some because you'll hear comments like, well, every life saved is worth any cost, right? And you'll hear that quite often,
right?
But is that the right way to think about it? Because we don't even live our lives that way. We take risks every day. We allow tens of thousands of automobile accidents. We don't blink an eye that there was 50,000 flu deaths. We don't actually live that way. So why does this make us change the way we think about ethics? Not everybody. Obviously, not everybody says that. What I just said, but a lot of people are. So, what do you think? Analyze the human psyche for me on this one.
Sure. No, I get what you're saying. I think part of the issue here is that there's this huge element of unpredictability. And so what people are registering when they're expressing that kind of, really strong position that any life is worth all the cost that there could be is, I think at an intuitive level, they're registering that this pandemic has a threat that goes beyond all the lives individually. So the lives are a terrible and, loss and a precious thing to work to protect. And we should all have consistently an orientation to broad protection of the lives of every single one of us. But so I think what they're registering is that because this pandemic is uncertain in its scale and scope, it's moving incredibly rapidly, it's clear that it has the potential to overwhelm our public health facilities, there is this deeper existential threat. And so it requires us to have a sort of strong defense response. So I think people are articulating that sort of intuition for the need of a strong defense response with those kinds of statements. It's just that when one has to sort of dig into it and realize that the sort of the sense of threat is really that if our institutions are made vulnerable by this pandemic, then we're all at risk, right? So that representation of sort of any cost to save a life is actually really a way of expressing any cost to save the stability of our society and the stability of institutions that can actually broadly secure health for all of us over time in a sustainable way. Yeah,
and we have this conversation on a daily basis with respect to policy. I don't remember a lot of things I read at Harvard, but I do remember this one thing. That's not true. I remember all of it. It was great. There was this one economics class I took, and the title of the paper was "Safety at Any Cost," and that particular paper was about regulations, mostly environmental regulations specific to the workplace, and the cost of a specific regulation compared to how many lives we actually think it saves, if any. And, and just an analysis of what that is. And maybe we're overreaching sometimes and the costs are just so enormous and we're not really getting any benefit out of them. And so we have these conversations all the time. And we should always be asking that question. Is it safety at any cost? And then on the other side, you hear people, I think, rightfully expressing concern that there are real costs to the economy and there's cost to the public health side when you devastate institutions, whether those are economic institutions or public health institutions. And there's an ethics question there too, isn't there?
Absolutely. So I'd like to divide that question into two parts, if you don't mind. And I think the first part is to spend a little time talking about the concept of safety. And then the second part would be to spend some time talking about the issue of the economic impact and how we can get past the devastation that we're experiencing and reboot our economy sooner rather than later. On the question of safety, for me, the touchstone for thinking about that concept is the Declaration of Independence. So I am going to dive into that text for a minute, if you'll permit me to do that.
Yeah.
So people forget that all-important second sentence about self-evident truths actually has a really important sort of aid in it for thinking about safety. So let me just remind everybody of what that second sentence is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, driving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Okay, so let's think about that word safety there for a moment in the end of that sentence. So what the sentence is saying is that we, the people, build a government in order to deliver safety and happiness. And in some sense, that kind of captures up the whole package. In order to secure safety and happiness, you have to have stable, well-functioning governmental institutions, right? So if you have a crisis that threatens those institutions in the first instance, you have to defend those institutions so that you can get back to the business of delivering safety and happiness. And then when you're in a context of sort of equilibrium with stable institutions, then absolutely the debate is exactly the kind of one you described, where we do have to trade off this cost versus that cost, what sort of maximally achieves our safety and happiness, where there's safety is one of our values, but we have other values too. We want freedoms, we want the ability to move about, we want therefore to tolerate a certain degree of risk in this kind of combined package of safety and happiness. So in a sort of steady state, that kind of trade-off reasoning makes a lot of sense. But in the moment that we're currently living in, right, the reasoning has gone back a level to the idea that the first thing you have to do is secure stable institutions in the first place that can do that work of figuring out how to deliver safety and happiness and work through trade-offs. So that then brings me back to the economy question. We're not in that sort of stable world of ordinary recognizable trade-offs. We're in this world where we have to restore the basic stability of our institutions, ranging from our health infrastructure to the public institutions that support them and whose legitimacy is tied to the success of our public health institutions and infrastructure. And on that point too, obviously, so we need to mobilize the economy to work on this. That means investing in all that production of ventilators and personal protective equipment. It means investing in testing at a mass scale. So lots and lots of people have lost jobs, but there's also lots and lots of work that needs to be done. So we should be moving really fast as a society to help people transition from one sort of structure of labor opportunities to another, because we need a lot of work done. So then the question is, okay, but aren't we all supposed to be sort of at home and not working? So how could we actually remobilize the workforce to do the work that we need? And the answer to that question, the key that unlocks the riddle, is massively scaled up testing. So even during this current period of significant quarantine, we could be really phasing people back to work if we could be testing at the level of 5 to 10 million tests a day.
Yeah.
So the single biggest production and supply chain needs we have are about the delivery of tests.
Yeah, and we agree on that. And I want to get into the details on that, but I want to stick to the lofty political theory for a little bit first.
Sure.
Okay. So
no worries.
Because it is interesting, and I like talking about the Declaration of Independence as the document that tells us why we have a government.
Yes.
And the Constitution as the document that tells us how to govern.
Bingo.
And yep. Well, thank you. All right. I win. I got an A in your class. Okay. So
absolutely.
And I try to remind people of that all the time. You know, the point of the Declaration is to show us that the purpose of government is to secure our rights.
Yep.
Not just from government, but from each other. And I have to remind people of that too, and what it means to implement justice. These are really interesting conversations to dive into. And again, we'll probably do this on the next podcast that you've promised to be on.
Sure, I would be delighted.
You didn't actually promise, but I just said it.
Okay,
and we can't take it back.
I'm promising now, so there we go.
I appreciate it. But these principles apply to this situation too, especially as like, when you ask difficult questions, and you guys wrote about this too in another white paper, and it's brought up in the first concept of freeze in place, which is, well, how do you enforce that, right? How do you make people safe? And and how do you stop people from making decisions that hurt themselves? And how do you distinguish and explain that to people? Because and I guess the way to explain it sometimes is, well, if you go out, you're infringing on the rights of somebody else because you put their health in jeopardy. And I think we're all kind of behind that as a country, right? Like there's a common sense right now. You're not hearing a lot of pushback against that. Well, you are a little bit, but what you really run into problems with is when you start saying we're going to punish you for that. So where do how do we talk about that?
So I think that is just absolutely the most important question. And this is where I think that is to say all of the American people, our elected leaders, but also every single one of us, have the job of asking the question, how does a democracy specifically handle a crisis like this? That's the question we're trying to answer. And so that's a question that honestly I don't think public health people can answer. And I don't think economists can answer. I think that's, it takes the intellectual ingenuity of democratic citizens and their elected officials. Yeah. And so the issue there is precisely as you put it, we have to do this on the basis of consent and voluntarism to the maximal degree possible. And where does a democracy get resources for that? In concepts of civic duty and civic solidarity. So the hard thing is, we have been so polarized and so partisan for quite a period of time now, which means we've depleted our most important national asset, which is our mutual commitment to one another.
Yeah.
And so we have to ramp that up as fast as we can because it is the distinctive asset that democracies can bring to crises of this kind.
Well, that's absolutely right. This sense of civic duty. I mean, the Declaration of Independence says that the government is there to protect your rights, but it maybe doesn't do a good enough job laying out the second part of that, which is that there is a responsibility amongst citizens to live morally and live with duty. Now our founders talked about that quite a bit.
And even the Declaration did, to be honest, right? Because just remember how it ends. We mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Yeah.
We need that mutual pledge now.
Well, that's a great point. And maybe some people are reading that and thinking, well, that's what the founders said because, they were in a war. But maybe we should be interpreting that to mean all of us.
Yes, I do interpret it exactly that way to mean all of us. And I mean, particularly in times of crisis, we really do need that mutual pledge to one another because that's how we can do it as a democracy. Yeah,
there's a sense of duty that takes place. Actually, one of my op-eds that just came out in, I don't know, somewhere. It was
very cool.
It was about duty.
Okay.
And
I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I think it's in Fox News.
I'll go check it out. Thank you.
And what I talk about is I start with a war story where, we go on a mission, and every mission you see in the movies all the time, which is like a SEAL platoon gets this mission from the top and then they get a quick intel briefing and then they go out. And I'm like, well, that's totally unrealistic. That's not at all how it works. Rarely is there a mission coming from the top. Usually it's built from the ground up. And to actually implement that mission, it requires everybody in that platoon to give 110% at their specific duty. And there's all these smaller missions that build up the bigger missions.
Wow.
It's the only way that it's actually successful. Mm-hmm. And this isn't much different. And we are fighting a war. It's not, it's a decent enough analogy, right? It's
not perfect.
Right.
I totally give you that. It's not perfect, but I think it does give us resources that we need at this particular moment in time.
Right. And it's not, we're in the habit politically these days of just nitpicking at everything everybody says. And it's like, let's just give each other some grace. It's a good enough analogy, right? We know what we're trying to say when we say it. And now the big difference I point out is in past wars, recent wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, only a very small percentage of the population is experiencing that war. This is quite different. Everybody is experiencing it, some to greater extents than others, but pretty much everybody.
Yep.
And it does require these small missions and small elements of duty, even if just not touching each other. I mean, very small things. Don't look at each other too much when you're talking to each other. Very simple things that can stop the spread.
Right.
And I'm sure we'll continue to find more things and ways we can contribute. So let's get into the three different paths and three different strategies that the white paper goes into. And one is freeze in place. And that's pretty self-explanatory. But I guess give us an overview of what that would actually mean. And I think people listening will be like, no, not that. But let's talk about it anyway.
Well, so we've frozen, right? We've shut down the economy basically through, national, almost at this point, national stay-at-home advisories and stay-at-home orders. That's the freezing part. So that both freezes down transmission of the disease, it slows the spread of it, and obviously freezes the economy. The problem with the disease is it's highly infectious. It's got a similar rate of infection to the Spanish flu in 1918. And so consequently, if you don't stop sort of social interactions, once there's a sufficient level of prevalence established, it will just keep spreading. So you have to sort of shut things down in order to slow the spread. Because the population is not immune, in the technical language, we're a susceptible population to this new virus. Once we lift the social distancing restrictions, the disease would eventually emerge if we did nothing to reemerge, if we did nothing to control it. Mm-hmm. And so on the sort of freeze in place picture, what you end up having happen is that you have these sort of repeated applications of social distancing to get us through a kind of 12 to 18 month period to the point where there's either a vaccine developed or we've actually achieved herd immunity because enough people have in fact had the disease. And so what freeze in place does is sort of transition to a point where the population is no longer susceptible without overwhelming the medical system, and in a way that reduces the actual number of lives likely to be lost. But so the problem with that, I mean, we already know what it is. The economic impact is devastating.
Yeah.
And so then you are in fact just destroying society by another means. So it's not really a viable solution pathway, though some countries like Denmark are attempting it in the sense that they have tried to put economic measures in place through public investment to keep companies from shrinking their employment roles, so that when companies can sort of open up again, they can just sort of start right up from where they left off. At any rate, it seems to me unlikely that actually can carry an economy through, and it also, at the end of that 12 to 18 month process, leaves the economy just as vulnerable to pandemic at the end of the process as it was at the beginning. That seems to me pretty short-sighted.
Yeah, and I mean, would you agree that's kind of what we're doing right now, though?
That is the path that we started out on. Yes, that is the path that we started out on.
And maybe we didn't have a choice, but we definitely, but as you point out, as a long-term solution, this is impossible. I mean, we've had 10 million unemployment applications in only a couple weeks.
That's right.
It's
exactly
turning off the economy is, and again, going back to the ethics question, you are ruining people's lives. I mean, we are just ruining lives. The suicide rates will go up, and there's many indications of that already. Yeah. And there's a real trade-off here. So do you think
that's why we need an alternative strategy?
Yeah. And I think everybody agrees with that. And so in the next, the more, which is your all's preferred strategy, which is mobilize and transition. The way I've been talking about this is we're in a risk containment strategy now, and we need to move to a risk mitigation strategy, I think I'm saying this exact same thing that you all say here. So in mobilize and transition, lay that out for us. What is that second phase? Sure.
So one of the important things we have to recognize is that in 2003, there was a SARS epidemic, and that particularly hit Asian nations. And the SARS epidemic is it's also a coronavirus. It's not the same coronavirus, but it's also a coronavirus. So there are many similarities to that experience in that context and the experience we're having now. And so countries like Singapore and South Korea and places like Hong Kong and Taiwan really learned lessons from that, and they reorganized key parts of their health infrastructure and therefore key parts of their economy to support what we call pandemic resilience. It's also called pandemic preparedness, but I think pandemic resilience better captures the concept. So they prepared themselves to do testing at a very significant scale to support universal mask wearing, a variety of other techniques that mean that you can keep the economy open even during a pandemic. And so it's that concept of keeping the economy open even while you have a pandemic that we're capturing by the resilience concept. And at the end of the day, given how globalized our world is, we should all want to have a pandemic resilient economy. So we did not lay in those preparations the way other countries did. So what mobilize and transition is a paradigm, is the view that over the next 2 to 3 months, We need to lay in the infrastructure that, say, Taiwan spent 5 years laying in. Okay, so to give you a sense of the scale.
Yeah.
So we need to massively ramp up our capacity to supply tests. We need to massively ramp up our capacity here in this country to produce and supply personal protective equipment. We need to invest in health infrastructure so that we have that ICU surge capacity. And we want these kinds of investments to be about a durable transition of our economy to ongoing sustainable pandemic resilience. So that's the sense in which it's not just mobilized. It's not just about let's get masks to the front healthcare workers now. It's transition, because once we slow the spread in these first 2 to 3 months, what we want to do is reopen the economy and not have to have any more national collective social distancing. And the only way you can achieve that is if you can genuinely control the disease, even while the economy is open. And the only tools available for doing that are this combination of testing and mask wearing and use of thermal scanners at key social gathering places and things like that. So lay in all that structure of pandemic preparedness or pandemic resilience in the next 2 to 3 months, so that when everything is fully open again, we can keep it open, even though the disease will continue to percolate, but hopefully at low levels and not at the levels that sort of produce the exponential increase.
And in the paper, y'all designate 3 months as sort of our time period to do both things: keep people in quarantine, but ramp up our preparedness in the public health system and in our supply chains. How'd you come up with 3 months? I was just curious.
So we've been doing a lot of modeling and trying to figure out what's possible, both from an epidemiological perspective and from an economic perspective. And so this is where we're sort of seeing a convergence of what we think the country has capacity for from a mobilization point of view, and what seems to be necessary from an epidemiological point of view to flatten the curve, so to speak, to get that reproduction of the rate to the virus below 1. Because all this sort of massive testing and so forth, what it can do now is help people return to work who can either prove immunity or prove recent negative tests. So they would have to repeat every 2 to 3 days. All right. But testing itself can't bring the reproduction rate of the virus below 1. Okay. It's not enough to do that. It should be enough to maintain a rate that's below 1 once you get there. But so that's why we need both the social distancing and to ramp up the testing now. And we think, again, the sort of modeling suggests it would take 2 to 3 months to get to that place where the reproduction number is below 1. And then the goal is to stay below 1 for the duration until there's a vaccine or until there's herd immunity, using a testing strategy rather than using a social distancing strategy.
And it really relies on this notion that we actually are immune if we've already had it. Does it look like we're...
It doesn't...
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. So the policy doesn't rely on that, actually. Immunity is a helpful thing, but not a necessary thing for this policy. We don't yet know the picture on immunity. We're about a month away, probably, from having the sort of full scientific picture on the immunity front. But so what you can do, instead of relying on immunity, you rely on very, very frequent testing that can show negative test results. But so that's what you need when R is above 1. Once R gets below 1, then you still need massive testing, but your goal is to find people who are sick and to support that with contact tracing so that you're staying ahead of the disease. You're keeping ahead of it. You're getting people treated. You're getting people to quarantine. So we would still need individual quarantine once the economy is back open, but we wouldn't need collective social distancing.
Okay, I just need to put this in the layman's terms for people real quick. When you say R less than 1, R over 1, you're meaning that the ability of one person to infect either if they can only infect less than 1 people on average, then we're in a good place. If they're still infecting more than 1 person, on average, I guess would be the right term, then that's bad. And we're continuing to increase the number of people infected.
Exactly.
So
it's a manageable it's a manageable situation as long as any given person who becomes infected infects on average fewer than one other person.
Yeah, and again, this seems to me what the question is really: can we even, because 3 months means June, mid-June is when we would actually move into what I would call a more risk mitigation strategy, and what you guys call a mobilize and transition strategy. But even that, given 2 weeks that we've had 10 million jobs lost, it's not even clear we can last that long. The economic package is similar to what you described as happening in Denmark, where we're really trying to keep businesses afloat while we press pause on the economy. That's designed to last a couple months, so it almost gets us there. And we need to hope that R is less than 1 by that point, or because we can't continue to prop up the economy indefinitely. There's, the modern monetary theory might be thrown around as an interesting theory, but I don't think it works in practice, and we don't have those resources to publicly finance the economy forever.
Yep. No, I agree. No, I mean, that's where sort of part of the mobilize and transition paradigm is that we can start reopening the economy earlier than June, but in this phased way. So,
yeah. And depending on each state too, each state's going to be different.
Well, right, but so actually, this is not a sort of state by state picture. This is a sector by sector picture, and it depends on testing. So, if we could start testing next week at the rate of 5 million tests a day, then we can make sure that all healthcare workers and all childcare workers who need to support healthcare workers could go back to work, right? And to the degree that healthcare workers need more childcare than they needed in the past, some of the people who have fallen into unemployment could be pulled into that care work. And ditto, insofar as the food supply chain is suffering from the lack of childcare workers for people in all the different sort of links in the food supply chain, then we want to get testing across the food supply chain and pull care workers, childcare workers in sort of backline defense for them to get them back into the economy. And then relatedly, there's all the sort of issue of public safety workers and ditto, like they need childcare too. I mean, when your kids are at home and you're supposed to be out on the job, it's a really problematic situation. So like there's another whole need for childcare there while we are working to get schools reopened. So there's lots of intersecting pieces, but we could be reopening parts of the economy now and blunting the impact of what we're currently suffering if we could get testing up to 5 million a day.
Yeah, and so what you're talking about is targeted testing, either to certain industries that interact with each other, or certain groups of people that actually interact with each other that we need to be healthy and need to be prioritizing. It kind of brings up.
We're talking about the sort of the first line of defense, essential workers, right? Sort of for the crisis, healthcare workers, food supply chain workers, public safety workers, and then all the childcare workers and supports that it would take to keep all those parts of the economy at not just full operations in sort of standard times, but at sort of surge level of operations.
It kind of brings up another interesting question, which is, are we doing it the wrong way now? So in Houston, we have DriveThru Testing, and we still ask that we still try to get only test to people who really have symptoms, but we're not asking them where they work or why they really need the test. And so the question becomes, should we just be stockpiling tests because we're already in lockdown? And if you're sick, you're supposed to just go to the emergency room and call 911. So are we wasting tests right now? It's an honest question.
It's not that we're wasting tests. It's just that we need so many more. And we have set our sight. We have been insufficiently ambitious. This is a great company. We can do this. We have to set our ambitions at a higher level. Yeah. And we're not talking about a moonshot, because this is not about doing something we've never done before or don't know how to do. I've heard somebody say this is much more like Eisenhower's laying out the national highway infrastructure. We know how to do it. It's a logistics problem. Yeah. And so what we need is really sort of significant coordination across the corporate sector and in tight coordination with government to achieve a really ambitious testing goal. Yeah.
And we are seeing these tests ramp up rapidly, many different companies. I mean, we're down to, we were at a matter of 2 weeks, a few weeks ago, and now we're at 5 to 15 minutes. So there is some hope, it seems, that our American innovative capacity can quickly reach where we need to reach. But there's more than just testing, of course. You guys talk about the IT required for contact tracing, proof of immunity screen. So that's a different test, testing for antibodies. And then just getting the public policy right on how to isolate vulnerable populations. And this is something a lot of people talk about too. Why can't we just isolate the vulnerable populations? The counter argument to that, what I hear from public health officials sometimes is, well, keep in mind, we are seeing younger, healthier people in emergent or in ICUs also. I push back against that a little bit because when I do look at the data, and New York is the most data we have right now, it's still overwhelmingly clear that if you don't have an underlying health condition, it's highly unlikely you'll end up in the ICU still by the data. So I push back against that a little bit. And I do think we can target our public policy towards vulnerable populations. And you all talk about that in here as well, right?
Yes. I think in an ongoing way, we will want to sort of pay attention to high risk categories, and the expectation, I think, would be that they would maintain a sort of a stricter protocol of social distancing over a longer period of time. But the sort of issue is that the sort of issue of asymptomatic carriers can really accelerate the spread of the disease. And so that's why it doesn't work just to sort of separate or sort of stratify by, say, age or something like that for responding to this, because you still have people carrying, and even if younger people are not necessarily as prone to, or sort of the case fatality rate is lower in lower age groups, still the case the disease has a long course and can be severe and has the capacity to really disable workplace context because it spreads so quickly and so rapidly. So there is a sort of collective problem here, and one that isn't solved by stratification by age.
Yeah, I guess some people would suggest that if you have a workplace full of different people from different age groups, you can tell people to get back to work except for the people from a certain age group or somebody with diabetes or somebody with a underlying heart condition. You make sure they stay at home and don't interact with anybody. I think that's maybe what people mean by that. But even then, that's also just individual problem solving. That really there can be public policy guidelines, but again, we talked about duty before, and everybody just being smart. We understand this well enough at this point that we can individually problem solve and find those solutions on a micro basis, I would think.
Mm-hmm. I think to some extent, but that's where I think the really hard part is the way the disease spreads and what the consequences of that are. So at the end of the day, you need workers in senior care facilities who aren't going to be spreading the disease, for example. And that's where the sort of social stratification picture starts to break down a little bit, because if you have younger people who are also working in the context of kind of care for more vulnerable populations, if younger people are sort of moving about with full mobility in a context where the rate at which the disease is transmitted is still high, you won't be able to keep that sort of it'll be a permeable barrier between your stratified and protected populations and everybody else. And I think there's good reason to be skeptical that that's a viable pathway.
Yeah, certainly in the long term, I'm sure it wouldn't be. This part of the paper stood out to me. It says, throughout the periods of quarantine, individuals who can be tested serologically and shown to have immunity would be exempt from quarantine as soon as they have immunity, and on the condition that they deploy in the Medical Reserve Corps, which is a group of volunteers overseen by Department of Health and Human Services that supports pandemic activities. That one stood out to me just because it seemed a little bit more extreme than everything else in the in the paper as far as making people go join this particular group. So what's the thinking behind that?
So the thinking behind that is that while we are all under these stay-at-home orders or stay-at-home advisories, it's a really privileged thing to have the chance to have, sort of certification that gives you mobility, gives you mobility rights ahead of everybody else. And that the right thing to do is to couple that concept of privilege with the concept of service. So I think that's not the only sort of service pathway that necessarily makes sense. But I do think that there's a lot of service work to be done right now. In California has just set up a big network of volunteers to check on seniors, for example. And so this goes back to the issue of just how much sort of need there is for labor in this economy. And to some extent, it can be about sort of redeploying people who've lost jobs, but there's a huge room for service. And it comes back to your wonderful language about how there's a sort of number of small missions. It's like, what are all the small missions that we all need to do that add up to a bigger mission? And so the basic idea is that for the kind of the core basis for getting mobility rights back ahead of other people should be a service basis.
Yeah, and
so hence the like essential workers piece and so forth. But then for others who aren't necessarily on the front lines, and they need to spend some time on the front lines as a part of that transition back. This is talking about like the next 2 to 3 months when most of us are still obliged to be at home.
Yeah, and it does seem to me that maybe it would be government's role to streamline or make more efficient the ability to find where those elements of service are. There's so many nonprofits out there across the country doing all sorts of things, churches doing meal deliveries, all of that. And it's like, and if you're not doing any of that, just, oh my God, just buy takeout. Just buy takeout. Right. These restaurants are going under. I talk to them all the time. It's terrifying because, I mean, here in Houston, I don't know what you're in Boston, I'm assuming, right?
Yep. Cambridge.
So, here in Houston, it's hard on people because the economy is devastated. The oil industry is devastated for reasons mostly related to Corona, but also some geopolitical reasons as well.
Right.
Which hopefully are solved as people hear this hot podcast. We'll see. But and I'd also like to get people from Boston to start buying U.S. natural gas. I'm just going to throw that out there for any of my Boston listeners.
Okay.
No more Russian natural gas. But anyway, the point is people are devastated by the economy and they're not seeing the pandemic. We're the fourth largest city in America, but our case rates just are not increasing very much. It's still less than 100 every single day. And frankly, that's obviously good news, and it means the social distancing is working. But people are getting very, very anxious, and even telling them until June is impossible. And they need to hear stuff like this. They need to hear that, hey, there is other ways of thinking about this, right? Like, let's ramp up our testing. Let's focus on certain industries. We can focus on one industry at a time. Make sure they are tested and insulated, and as you described. Look into the test people for antibodies. There's ways to go about this, and we need to have purpose. I think what our leaders are generally lacking, especially at the local and state level, because that's where these actual lockdowns come from. People keep looking to the federal government, but even if you look at the 30-day, the CDC guidelines of 30 days to slow the spread, these are not lockdowns. These are guidelines, and they're rather loose compared to what a lot of cities are doing themselves. Which I think is appropriate. I do not want to see the president locking down states or reopening the entire country either. Some people call for that in either direction, and I'm glad he's resisted that.
Yeah, I agree.
But people need timelines, and I think you guys talk about that at one point in this. I mean, timelines just for our sanity are so important, and then we have to be bold enough to say, listen, when we have this many masks and this many ventilators, like, we're going to feel good about it. When we have this much hospital space, and here in Houston, we have so many resources. We can, and you guys talk about this in a different white paper too, the mobilizing the political economy. You got to get a little bit creative. If you want to save the cruise line industry, rent out their spaces. You want to save the hotel industry, rent out their hotel rooms. So there's ways to think about this, and these things are being done. It's not like we're the first ones to think about it. But there seems to be like there are some creative ways, but I worry a great deal that we're paralyzed by fear, and I worry a great deal that these kind of voices like yours and the people who wrote this white paper are not at the table enough. It's good to hear from our public health side. It's good that our mayor here is hearing from the Texas Medical Center, but they need to hear from others as well. There's more to the story, I think, and so.
Well, we're in the process of trying to connect to networks of mayors around the country. So, starting at the Kennedy School with, there's a city's initiative, mayor's initiative at the Kennedy School. So we're connecting with them and trying to share with them, reaching out as well, trying to connect to state government in various ways. So, and trying to share the sort of findings that we're developing with the federal government as well. I mean, I think a lot of people have been, complaining about the sort of distribution of authority and burden between states and the federal government. And of course, there's a kind of underlying constitutional reason for that public health authorities lie largely with the states. But I think it's really important that we see our federal structure as an asset It's not a liability. We should be really excited that we have it because it does provide sort of modularized flexibility. We do need all levels of it to be acting. So we do need, the state level, the municipal level, and also the federal level to be acting. And we need them, in the end of the day, all to be acting in a kind of coordinated fashion. So there is a sort of need for coordination, but it's really a great thing that we can act across all these different levels. And so what I would ask about Houston is the case rate increasing? Because if the case rate is not increasing, if it's sort of steady, then you guys should really be pushing forward on the testing regime, sort of testing, contact tracing regime. Because if that's, if you guys are in that situation already, you could probably manage in a way that gave you the opportunity to make the case that you guys should be sort of opening up sooner than other places. And so I do think with regard to the opening piece, there is quite likely to be regional variation. And that is a challenge because of our sort of expectations and comfort with internal domestic travel. And I don't think anybody quite has a very clear answer to that as of yet. But nonetheless.
Well, our governor said no more Louisianans.
Right.
Not exactly.
Right.
He just said you have to quarantine if you're coming. So, I mean, but the point is that there's these targeted solutions.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yes. And so I do think we should take advantage of that sort of the modularity that our flexible structure gives, our federal structure rather gives us.
Yeah. And if we had more time and again, for the next podcast, we talk about more broader political theory terms. But as it pertains to civics, this entire crisis is a good reminder that it is your local and state governments that really affect your life and that really manage a crisis. And the federal government is there to support on the back end. But it does seem to me that, and this is driven by our media to an enormous extent, that everything falls onto the president, whether it's good or bad. And that just seems like the wrong way of thinking about it to an enormous extent.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think we need the federal government for one thing specifically, and that has to do with achieving the sort of the production supply chain that I've been talking about for testing. That's the kind of thing that can't be done on a state-by-state basis because basically states end up competing with each other.
Yeah.
So that really does have to be driven at the federal level. But that's the main piece. And then a whole heck of a lot of the rest of it, testing administration, contact tracing regimens, specific choices about how to exempt people from social distancing requirements and things like that. Those really can be state and municipal level decisions. So, I think we have we still have a lot of work to do, obviously, to have all the elements of a kind of fully coherent policy roadmap across all the jurisdictional levels. But it does matter to see that the sort of responsibilities and authorities, pieces do lie with federal government, and then huge pieces lie with states, and then also really important pieces lie with municipal governments.
Yeah, well, we agree on that. And we thank you for you and your colleagues for doing all this work and laying this out. It is certainly something I'll be talking about more.
Great.
As a public policy standpoint, and look forward to having you on again. I was very impressed with how you answered questions about your book called Our Declaration.
Oh, thank you.
Because it is a partisan crowd. I mean, there was a lot of members of Congress in the audience, and I knew exactly what was going to be asked before it was asked, and I'm always impressed when people can navigate the sort of bad faith questions and but still give great answers. And so everybody, all our listeners, will look forward to having you on again. And
thank you.
Hopefully at a different time when we're thinking about other things besides the coronavirus.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time. And if there's any way, the group I've been working with can help Congress think about these things, we would be so happy to do that. So call on us. We do think of this as an all hands on deck moment. We are doing our best to be of service to the country. So call on us and we will help in any way we can.